You climb the marble steps of Palatine Hill beneath torches that sputter in the night wind. The gold-lettered invitation in your hand should mean triumph, an emperor's favor, but it feels heavier than a death sentence. Guards in polished armor glance away as you pass. Their silence is its own warning. Inside, incense clouds the air, sweet but cloying, unable to smother the sour tang of fear. Senators, merchants, generals, their wives, all gathered in uneasy clusters, speaking in whispers that die quickly against the marble walls. Then it comes a ripple of footsteps, followed by laughter so sharp it makes your ribs tighten. Caligula enters draped in silks that shimmer like molten metal. His eyes roam the room with the hunger of a predator, choosing which throat to taste first. When his hands clap together, the sound echoes like a gavel striking down judgment. "Tonight we test loyalty," he purrs, as if daring anyone to move. You realize this isn't a banquet, it's theater, a stage where power feeds on humiliation. Historians still argue whether these feasts were embellished by hostile writers, but standing here, every detail feels too deliberate to be fiction. You understand why Rome's most noble men leave these dinners smaller, broken shadows of themselves. They once called him Little Boots. A child of the camps, Caligula trailed behind the legions in miniature armor. A mascot adored by soldiers who saw in him a promise of Rome's future. But beneath the playful nickname lay a family legacy already curdling. His father Germanicus, the Golden General, beloved by the people, fell suddenly ill and died in Syria. Whispers of poison drifted back to Rome. Fingers pointed toward Emperor Tiberius, whose paranoia had sharpened into a knife aimed at anyone with popular support. The boy was 7 when grief became his tutor. He watched his mother, Agrippina the Elder, stripped of influence and exiled to a barren island where she starved herself to death rather than yield. His brothers followed into prison and execution, the line of Germanicus systematically erased. For Caligula, survival meant silence. He learned early to wear masks. Harmless child, eager pupil, pliant heir. Behind those masks, though, the lessons were written deep. No love could be trusted, no kinship spared from betrayal. Some historians argue that this crucible of fear and loss shaped the cruelty that later surfaced in his reign. Trauma was not incidental, it was foundational. To watch your family destroyed one by one, and to know that your own life depended on feigned innocence, is to internalize power as a game of masks and daggers. Yet others caution against psychologizing too freely. Roman historians had their own motives, eager to paint Caligula's descent into depravity as inevitable, the product of a cursed bloodline rather than the politics of empire. Still, the gory details of his youth endure. Imagine the child standing in the corridors of Capri, where Tiberius kept his dark retreat, surrounded by statues and spies. The boy's silence was not just survival, it was apprenticeship. He learned the value of secrecy, the thrill of watching others squirm, the fatal cost of showing weakness. Later writers described Caligula as a master performer, able to charm or terrify at will. The roots of that performance can be traced to these early years. The child who could smile while plotting. The boy who played at soldier while learning that Rome's greatest generals could be undone by whispers. Whether myth or fact, the narrative frames him as a creature born of political terror, a figure molded by fear long before he wielded fear as his own weapon. And so, when power finally fell into his hands, he carried with him not only the adoration of the legions who once nicknamed him, but also the shadows of every betrayal that had marked his childhood. Little Boots, grown tall, had learned that love is fleeting, loyalty is fragile, and the only truth worth trusting is the power to make others bend. When Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, Rome exhaled as though the city itself had been holding its breath for decades. The old emperor's reign had been marked by suspicion, exile, and executions that drained the Senate of spirit. Into that void stepped Caligula, just 24, the son of Germanicus, the darling child once paraded before the legions. His arrival felt like a return to light after years of gloom. Crowds gathered in the Forum to cheer his name. He recalled political exiles, restoring broken families to prominence. He granted bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, buying not only their loyalty, but their devotion. Games erupted across the empire. spectacles of chariots and gladiators that reminded Romans of their grandeur. Coins struck with his image carried the promise of renewal. For 7 months, he embodied what many hoped he would always be, the bridge to a golden age. Historians still debate how deep this early popularity ran. Some argue it was genuine relief, a populace desperate for a young ruler with the blood of Germanicus. Others note the cynical mechanics, lavish spending, extravagant games, and calculated gestures designed to buy love rather than earn it. Yet even the skeptics concede. For a brief moment, Caligula's Rome pulsed with real optimism. In Senate chambers, aged statesmen marveled at his composure. He listened, at least on the surface, and responded with gestures of reconciliation. Bread and circuses, yes, but also the sense that the empire had escaped the long shadow of Tiberius' paranoia. Even whispers of cruelty that trailed him from Capri were smothered beneath the roar of a grateful people. There were omens, however, threads that, in hindsight, look like cracks in a mask, a lavishness beyond reason in his expenditures, an occasional glint in his eye when the crowd cheered, as if he savored not just their love, but their dependency. But such shadows were easy to dismiss. After all, hadn't Rome earned this reprieve? For a fleeting 7 months, Caligula was not the monster of legend, but the hope of empire. Senators toasted him, plebeians celebrated him. The guard swore by him. The boy in the soldier's boots had grown into a man who seemed destined to carry Rome forward. No one could yet imagine how quickly that promise would sour, or how dramatically a single illness could turn the beloved prince into the tyrant whose name still drips with dread. It began with a fever. In late 37 CE, barely months into his reign, Caligula collapsed with what ancient sources describe as a violent illness of the brain. For days, the empire held its breath as he hovered between life and death. Priests offered sacrifices, crowds prayed in temples, and senators prepared speeches in case the young ruler passed too soon. When he finally staggered back from the brink, Rome rejoiced. But those closest to him noticed the difference immediately. The man who returned was not the same youth who had charmed the forum. His smile grew sharper, edged with something mocking. His decisions became erratic. Lavish building projects launched without planning, sudden reversals in policy, strange nocturnal habits whispered about in corridors. Historians have wrestled with this turning point for centuries. Was it true brain damage, as some claim, rewiring his impulses and loosening the fragile restraints of reason? Or had the illness simply lifted the mask, exposing appetites he had always carried beneath a careful veneer? Ancient gossip paints the fever as a threshold moment. One day, a generous young emperor; the next, a man unmoored from restraint. But even among scholars today, there is disagreement. Some argue his excesses were exaggerated by hostile senators and later historians eager to vilify him. Others maintain the consistency of accounts points to real transformation, an unraveling triggered by physical collapse. Inside the palace, the change was felt first by those who served. Longtime attendants began to flinch at his commands. He demanded peculiar entertainments, toys of cruelty dressed as amusements. Nights grew louder, stranger, filled with sudden summons and laughter that did not sound entirely human. The emperor had tasted death and returned with the conviction that no boundary could bind him. Outside, the people still cheered their golden prince. Bread and circuses continued, masks polished to shine for the crowds. But behind closed doors, Caligula discovered the intoxication of absolute power. He could demand, humiliate, degrade, and nothing, not senate, nor soldier, nor god, seemed capable of saying no. What began as whispers of eccentricity would soon harden into dread. The palace was shifting, stone by stone, into something Rome had never seen before. Not just a seat of empire, but a theater built for one man's appetites. The palace on Palatine Hill was no longer merely a seat of governance. It was being refitted like a theater. Servants spoke of rooms rearranged, couches drawn into circles, walls lined with draperies, alcoves designed not for privacy but for spectacle. Caligula's own chamber, unlike any emperor's before him, included raised seating so an audience could observe his most intimate encounters. The line between bedroom and stage was deliberately erased. Visitors began to whisper of a palace brothel hidden in plain sight. Wives and daughters of senators, women once draped in the dignity of Rome's highest families, were compelled to serve not just the emperor, but also his guests, foreign envoys, even favored soldiers. Ancient accounts describe Caligula personally directing these scenes like a playwright, positioning participants, offering mocking commentary. Scholars remain divided on how much of this was propaganda. Was there truly a brothel within the palace, or were these accusations sharpened by hostile senators eager to stain his memory? Still, fragments of architecture suggest spaces adapted for such performances, and the persistence of the story across sources is difficult to dismiss. What could not be denied was the atmosphere. Banquets that began as ordinary feasts dissolved into staged humiliations. Senators, seated with forced smiles, watched their wives summoned to the center as Caligula commented idly on their features, deciding how best to display them. The cruelty was not hidden, it was choreographed. For Caligula, the pleasure lay not only in indulgence, but in degradation, reminding Rome's elite that even their most private bonds belonged to him. For the scholars of today, this raises the question, was Caligula innovating new forms of tyranny, or merely exposing the fragility already woven into Roman politics? Marriage alliances had always been political tools. Chastity vows had always been subject to the emperor's favor, yet by transforming domestic virtue into public theater, Caligula stripped away the pretenses of tradition and left only raw power. Those who walked the corridors at night heard echoes of forced laughter, doors creaking open at the emperor's whim, and the muffled weeping of women who once commanded respect. The palace, marble and gold on the outside, was acquiring a reputation that made even Rome's hardened aristocracy tremble. And while some insisted later that these tales were exaggerated, anyone who attended those gatherings knew the feeling, the sense of being trapped in a stage play where the script was written by madness. And the only role left was humiliation. Seating arrangements became instruments of cruelty. Senators were placed where their eyes could not avoid the sight of their wives summoned forward. Caligula's voice, deceptively casual, would comment on a woman's beauty before demanding proof of loyalty in ways no Roman code could sanction. Husbands clenched their fists but did not move. To protest was to condemn one's entire family. The emperor seemed to savor their paralysis as much as any act itself. This was loyalty measured in humiliation. Rome's proudest men, once arbiters of law and guardians of tradition, were forced into complicity. Some delivered their daughters to the emperor's chamber with trembling hands. Others assisted in preparing their wives, arranging garments, as if participation could soften the sting of dishonor. Caligula's genius, if cruelty can bear such a name, was in making men betray their own households. By compelling fathers, husbands, and brothers to facilitate degradation, he shattered the foundations of Roman honor more completely than whips or chains could. Ancient accounts describe these nights with a blend of awe and disgust. Some claim Caligula laughed hardest when watching the faces of men reduced to silence, their authority unmade before their peers. Yet scholars caution that our knowledge is colored by senatorial sources eager to justify his later assassination. Were these scenes as orchestrated as described, or did memory exaggerate the scale to absolve Rome's elite of their passivity? What remains consistent is the theme: power enforced not with armies, but with the intimate ruin of families. The psychological toll was immense. Children old enough to understand sat frozen, witnessing acts they could never unsee. Marriages collapsed under the weight of shared trauma. Bloodlines prided for centuries on discipline and virtue now carried secrets that festered in silence. Some women resisted, attempting suicide rather than endure again, only to doom their families to collective punishment. Others broke entirely, their spirits crushed until submission became second nature. And the men, they emerged from these nights altered, stripped of the authority that once defined their role in Rome. Senators who had tied down their own wives at the emperor's command could never again speak with the same dignity in the Senate. Their complicity was the emperor's ultimate weapon, leaving them powerless not only in the moment, but forever after. In this theater of forced loyalty, humiliation was both method and message. Caligula had discovered that Rome could be ruled not simply through law or steel, but through the quiet destruction of dignity. Once a man accepts his family's degradation in silence, there is little left he will not accept. Rome had long bound its power to ritual. Marriages sealed alliances, sacrifices affirmed the favor of the gods, and Senate meetings cloaked politics in solemnity. Caligula twisted each of these forms until they no longer resembled the traditions Romans had known for centuries. What was once sacred became spectacle. He married often, sometimes discarding a bride within days. At one infamous ceremony, he consummated the marriage in front of the entire gathering, forcing the bride's father to watch. Ancient writers describe the act as a deliberate inversion of Roman piety, the private bond of family recast as a public humiliation. Modern scholars debate the reliability of these accounts. Were they exaggerations to paint Caligula as monstrous, or true examples of a ruler who delighted in upending Rome's most intimate customs? Whatever the embellishment, the message was clear. Institutions meant to stabilize society became props in his theater of domination. Even the Senate was not spared. On occasion, Caligula demanded that senators' wives perform services during formal debates, blurring governance with degradation. Decrees that would shape the empire were passed under the shadow of humiliation. Senators robbed of dignity found themselves unable to resist policies they might otherwise have opposed. Religion, too, was rewritten. Caligula declared himself a living god, ordering temples rededicated in his name. Festivals once devoted to Jupiter or Mars became occasions for public orgies, with noble families compelled to provide unwilling participants. Priestesses sworn to chastity were forced into acts that mocked their vows, leaving worshippers unsure whether they were celebrating or desecrating. Scholars still argue over whether Caligula believed his own divinity or used the claim as political theater. Either way, the outcome was the same. The lines between worship, politics, and pleasure collapsed. These transformations unsettled even those accustomed to Rome's pragmatic approach to religion. Rituals had always served politics, but never so crudely. Caligula's genius or madness lay in stripping the symbols bare. No senator could claim to honor the gods while his wife was debased before the altar. No father could speak of virtue after watching his daughter paraded as a temple offering. What began as whispers of eccentricity hardened into dread. Each ceremony reminded Rome's elite that the emperor owned not only their wealth and offices, but their very souls. To resist was sacrilege. To obey was humiliation, and in that paradox, Caligula discovered a new form of power. The contagion did not stop at the palace gates. Stories carried by couriers and governors spread Caligula's methods outward, and soon provincial officials began to imitate the model. In far-flung cities, governors staged spectacles where local elites were compelled to offer their wives and daughters in shows of loyalty. What began as whispers of decadence in Rome became a pattern that echoed across the empire, each imitation reinforcing the emperor's reach. For families in the provinces, the dread was magnified by distance. Refusing an official's command could mean charges of treason, and no appeal to the emperor would save them. He had set the precedent himself. Some accounts describe governors competing to outdo one another, sending reports of ever more elaborate humiliations to Rome in hopes of gaining favor. Whether these reports were boasts or inventions, they reveal a truth. Local power holders recognized that sexual humiliation could be wielded as a political tool, and Caligula had provided the model. Scholars debate whether this spread was systemic or opportunistic. Was there truly an empire-wide policy of sexual terror, or did ambitious governors simply exploit the emperor's reputation to justify their own abuses? The evidence is fragmented, but the consistency of accusations from distant regions suggests more than coincidence. Even if not formal law, the shadow of Caligula's Rome gave license for cruelty elsewhere. The effect on provincial society was corrosive. Families who once offered daughters in marriage alliances now offered them to avoid punishment. Rituals of loyalty turned into veiled threats. Women across the empire learned to live with the knowledge that their bodies might be claimed for the sake of imperial favor. Men, meanwhile, discovered their honor could be stripped as easily in a provincial form as in the marble halls of Palatine Hill. And children, perhaps the most haunting legacy, were drawn into these spectacles. Ancient writers tread carefully here, their language veiled, but the implication is clear. The trauma seated in Rome was mirrored in the provinces. Generations would carry the scars, their understanding of power forever distorted. From Britain to Syria, the empire lived under the shadow of Rome's new theater. A single man's appetite had become a contagion, spreading not only acts of cruelty, but a philosophy that nothing, not marriage, nor religion, nor childhood itself, stood beyond the reach of imperial humiliation. The breaking point came in the shadows beneath the palace itself. By 41 CE, even those accustomed to Rome's brutal politics could no longer stomach the nightly degradations. Senators whispered of lost honor, generals muttered of squandered discipline, and the Praetorian Guard, men sworn to protect the emperor, began to imagine a different loyalty to each other. Conspiracies in Rome often left trails, yet this one gathered quietly in the underground corridors where guards shifted posts. Many of the conspirators carried private grievances. Some had seen their wives or sisters humiliated. Others had been forced to stand by while their own households were destroyed. Revenge mingled with politics until they became indistinguishable. The night of January 24th was unremarkable on the calendar, but it carried the charge of inevitability. Caligula moved through the subterranean passageways after a performance, perhaps still laughing, perhaps still flushed with the intoxication of power. Blades flashed in the gloom. Accounts vary. Some say he fought, others that he collapsed without resistance. What all agree upon is that the emperor, who believed himself a god, was struck down in the most human of ways, his body crumpling against the cold stone of his own palace. Historians debate the true motives of his killers. Was it purely personal revenge for private humiliations, or a calculated political move to save the empire from further collapse? The Senate had little role in the deed. The Guard acted first, guided less by ideology than by the unbearable memory of what they had witnessed. Modern scholars remind us that assassination in Rome was rarely clean. It was vengeance and strategy bound together, each cloaking the other. In the immediate aftermath, chaos loomed. An emperor dead without an heir could plunge the empire into civil war. Yet even as panic rippled through the palace, the conspirators felt something unfamiliar: relief. For years they had walked corridors heavy with incense and fear. Now, in the echo of his laughter extinguished, they allowed themselves to believe that Rome might heal. But healing was never simple. The blood on the stones marked not just the end of a reign, but the beginning of a reckoning, one that would reveal how deep the wounds of those years had already cut. In the days after the assassination, Rome entered a strange silence. The body was gone, the emperor erased, yet the shadows of what had unfolded in his palace remained. Claudius, plucked almost by accident from hiding behind a curtain, became the next emperor, and with him came the question: what to do with the evidence? The palace itself was full of reminders, rooms redesigned for spectacle, couches arranged in circles, records of names and encounters that could blackmail entire bloodlines. Some chambers were sealed, others remodeled, as if new plaster and fresh marble could erase the memory of what had occurred there. Officials quietly destroyed documents that cataloged victims, not to protect Caligula's name, but to shield families from further shame. The empire needed stability, not scandal. Historians centuries later would wrestle with this silence. Accounts of Caligula's reign are vivid, but often veiled, coded language hinting at atrocities without stating them outright. Scholars argue whether these stories were exaggerated by hostile senators or whether discretion was deliberate, a way to protect the broken survivors who could never speak openly. In either case, the result is the same. The full truth was buried with the victims' voices. For those who lived through it, silence became survival. Women who had been forced into degradation could not tell their stories without destroying what little honor remained. Men who had delivered their daughters or tied down their wives could not confess without admitting complicity. Children grew up carrying scars they dared not describe. Trauma seeped into the next generation, shaping families long after the emperor was gone. Tourists today walk the ruins of Palatine Hill, marveling at stone foundations and sweeping views. They hear of Caligula's extravagance, his cruelty, his madness, but rarely the details of what those walls witnessed. Yet, if you stand in the right place and let the noise of modern Rome fall away, The silence itself feels weighted. The palace is gone, but the ghosts remain. The senator's wife who chose death over another night. The boy who watched helplessly. The matron turned into a commodity. Caligula's reign lasted less than 4 years, but its echoes stretched across generations. The pattern he set, that absolute power can corrupt through intimacy as well as through war, would outlive him, resurfacing in subtler forms in courts and cults across history. His palace may be ruins now, but the lesson it holds endures. Dignity, once surrendered under fear, is nearly impossible to reclaim. The pace slows now. The echo of marble footsteps fades, replaced by something quieter, the hum of night above Palatine Hill, where ruins glow under moonlight. You can almost imagine the incense gone stale, the curtains long turned to dust, the stones still cool with memory. Rome moves on, the emperors come and go, but the silence of those walls lingers like a held breath. Think of the senators who never spoke again with confidence, their voices hollow in the chamber. Think of the women whose lives were folded into secrecy, their names erased, their pain unrecorded. Think of the children, grown old, who carried memories they could not share, who flinched at laughter that came too suddenly, or footsteps that echoed too sharply in a corridor. Trauma, like architecture, endures in fragments. History leaves us with ruins to admire and chronicles to parse, but it rarely gives us the soft truths: how survivors slept at night, how they tried to rebuild marriages, how they taught their children to trust when trust itself had been weaponized. In that absence, you supply the image yourself, a senator's widow, years later, tending a garden in silence, a child, now a man, walking past the palace ruins with lowered eyes. The lesson does not thunder, it whispers. Power is not only banners, armies, decrees. It is also what happens when fear creeps into the private corners of life. Caligula's legacy shows how easily the intimate can be broken and how breaking it can hold a people captive long after the tyrant is gone. So you let the ruins rest, let the ghosts settle into their stones, and carry forward a gentler truth, that remembering is itself a form of resistance. The night air cools, the story ebbs, and you are left with quiet, just quiet.